Well, this time we're going to talk a little, not so much more about dancing with unicorns as to answer a few questions. And I realize that very often questions arise and people are trying to sort their way through understandings. I was addressing myself largely to what are called young earth creationists a bit earlier. Of course, I believe in the divine creation of the heavens and the earth. But the problem arises when people have a model of reality and when they're absolute literalist and fundamentalist. Because they insist upon things that are patently false. Once upon a time might have been a misunderstanding, but now when educated people say them, they're simply a lie. And they're a lie to try to substantiate an ideology, not the faith. And I want to start off by discussing that a little bit too, because we're so locked into religion as an ideology. And we can see what's wrong with that if we stop and think for a moment. In this recent revolution in Egypt, there was very little bloodshed. There were some people beaten early on by the police, and a few people actually perished. But masses of 1 million people, there should have been thousands of deaths, but there weren't. Part of the reason why the moderation, first of all, Christians and Muslims and atheists were all there together, showing their unity. There was one magnificent moment when we saw the Christian monk, I believe an Orthodox monk from Mount Sinai, in fact, who had come down to Cairo, and he and a Muslim fellow reached up, crossed their arms, he holding a cross, the Muslim fellow holding the Quran, and they said, "We are united." So they united for the common good of the whole nation. Now, neither one of them compromised their faith at all. But they didn't let their religion stand in the way of what was for the common good. And of course they would all benefit equally from it at the end if they had a democratic society. Now, because they were moving against a civil dictatorship, it was possible for there to be a peaceful demonstration with almost no bloodshed, really. And one had to look in awe at the self-discipline and self-control of the protesters. Hundreds of thousands of people resisting violence, making sure, setting up their own roadblocks to make sure nobody brought any weapons onto the scene, constantly using modern technology to keep everything peaceful, everything ordered, everything organized, everyone together in a spirit of unity. When we look at the rebellion in Iran, we see a totally different picture. We see the most incredible savagery and brutality being used against the citizens of the nation, who are also peacefully protesting and wanting more democracy and more freedom, more liberties. What makes this one so savage, so brutal, so bloody? Because it's a religious dictatorship. And a religious dictatorship will always respond with far more cruelty, far more savagery, far more barbarism, because it thinks it's doing the work of God. This is religion, it is not faith. This is ideology. It is not a living faith, a living walk with God at all. And that's the huge difference that sometimes we want to make. I hold that fundamentalists and literalists do not have faith. And that is why they're so terrified of anything new, new understanding and new knowledge. Because they do not have faith. They panic because they have only a religious ideology. They do not have a living walk with Christ Jesus. They do not have a living faith. If they did, new knowledge, new understandings would not panic them, cast them to hysteria, or want them to respond with the language of fire, the language of hate and violence. Now, somebody asked me about other problems with the so-called young earth creationism. I made a couple of notes, and I want to read them. Recently we discovered that in the region which is now Croatia, in Yugoslavia, monoculture agriculture, the agricultural revolution, took place there about 8,000 years ago, or 6,000 years BC. The same in Nubia. It's very clear that in Nubia, which was at one time ruled Egypt, it was a part of the Egyptian empire, but the Nubians were the rulers. Monoculture agriculture was well underway by 5,000 BC, which is 7,000 years ago. And the same has to be said of the area of Sumer along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Monocropping there was well underway by 5,000 BC. And the proto-writing, which developed primarily in Chaldea or Sumer, was established before 4,500 BC. And concrete writing system with the full symbols capable of conveying not only business transactions, which the proto-writing did, but conveying literature, was being used before 3000 BC. And the town on the Euphrates, not really a city, but the town in the Valley Kori, was established certainly by 10,000 BC, 12,000 years ago. So these things are very clear, very well demonstrated, and very well proved. So what I'm going to address again are some of the religious ideologies we have, which create the language of hate, the language of malice, the language of violence. So you'll hear preachers, and you know, it's interesting because somebody suggested that I make a comparison between a DVD recording of Pat Benatar's, one of Pat Benatar. Those of you who don't remember her, she was a rather energetic woman singer. She had a great voice and some great songs, but she was also the kind that didn't wear much clothes and gyrated around the stage. And the lyrics of the songs were certainly, if not anti-religious, certainly not conducive to any kind of higher thought. And look at the audience. And then to look at a televangelist or one of these megachurches in the States, evangelical or fundamentalist megachurches. I did. The audience behaved in exactly the same way. Exactly the same waving of arms, exactly the same exaltations, and as in the case of some megachurches, some people would come up front in front of the pews and start dancing, even women pulling their dresses up a bit too high. This is in megachurches, not Pat Benatar. And the same thing, Pat Benatar is standing there exhorting the audience only musically. And in the megachurches, these hate-filled, malicious preachers who preach 50% of what they preach is malice and hate and violence. And they have the audience doing exactly the same thing that Pat Benatar had them doing. There's no difference. It's emotionalism. It is not of the Spirit. It has nothing to do with the Holy Spirit, with Jesus Christ, with God. It has to do with exactly the same kind of emotionalism that Pat Benatar or any other rock singer arouses in its audience. It's a kind of mass hypnosis, or as St. Anthony Khrapovitsky would say, mass Prelest, mass spiritual delusion. And in that mass spiritual delusion, they rob people of all reason, of all common sense, of all sobriety, which Apostle Paul commands, and send them into a frenzy of literally demonic ecstasies, which are mindless, senseless, empty. And those people leave there with a totally deluded concept of humanity, locked into models of reality and ideologies which are patently false. And that's a part of what creationism is all about. I'm not talking about people with sobriety, understanding and intelligence, understand that God created the heavens and the earth and everything that is on them. I'm talking about these people who thrive on this kind of ideology. And they preach against what science clearly teaches, clearly understands, and is clearly proved and clearly demonstrated. And they do it in order, first of all, to arouse fear. Because fear is the best way to control and manipulate people. That's why we have terrorists. Most of the televangelists I've seen, and the fundamentalist and literalist preachers, are nothing in the world but spiritual terrorists who incite fear in people so they can control and manipulate them. And they use that fear to rouse it to anger and to a kind of political activism which is not one bit different than what the Ayatollahs in Iran have done. Most of these people are advocating a kind of Christian Sharia, the Christian version of Islamic law. And it would be a savage, cruel, and brutal form of law, with death penalties for more things than you can count on your fingers. That kind of Taliban Christianity, which is poisoning and polluting the spiritual atmosphere on this earth, in the same way that we're poisoning and polluting the physical atmosphere on this earth. And whether anyone likes it or not, I'm going to repeat it again in clear terms. The earth is, somebody corrected me now with decimal points, so I'm not going to get quite that fine. The earth is about 4.5 billion years old. If you don't like it, that's just too bad, because that's the way it is. God created it, but it's 4.5 billion years old. The universe is 14.5, give or take billion years old. It's perfectly evident, perfectly simple to demonstrate. The other aspect of this that bothers me, some of you know that I've been involved in conversations with Islam for a long time, and I've been studying the development of atheism in Islam. There have been mass conversions to atheism in Islam. Our younger generations in North America, Western Europe, are simply drifting into atheism. One of the biggest causes of atheism is those of you who are fundamentalist literalists and spiritual terrorists. And I'm including quite a lot of the evangelical preachers these days. Something else we have to take up, and I've never shied away from anything controversial, but somebody sent me a catalog, a list, just a number, of those reported incidences, not maybe hundreds of unreported ones, or reported incidences, in which young teenagers, gay kids, have committed suicide, either after hearing a sermon by one of these spiritual terrorists, and some of them are in the Orthodox Church, I might add, or by being bullied so badly at school because the school children had been taught by Christians to be so full of hatred and malice that they would beat them severely, make their lives completely unlivable. The preachers who are preaching these things, whether Orthodox or not Orthodox, have a hand in homicide. They're not innocent of the deaths of these young people. And it's time that we stop using the rhetoric of hate and violence in the name of Christ, because Christ did not use that kind of language. Preachers who are preaching today with this kind of fear and hatred have no connection with Jesus Christ at all. They don't know Christ at all. They simply use his name as a front for their own neurosis, psychosis, and their own desire to manipulate and control people. They are not preaching the gospel. The gospel is not filled with hate and malice. There's a better way to approach things that you think are wrong and don't agree with. But sooner or later, people who are operating on ideology are going to have to realize that the American Medical Association, the Canadian and British medical associations, the equally professional in all three countries of pediatricians, a clinical psychologist and a psychiatrist, have a little more intelligence than they give them credit for. And the fact is, homosexuality is not a choice. People are born with it hardwired, and it's not changeable. Despite what some of these Protestant cults have claimed, we've seen the disasters and the catastrophes that have come from their so-called deprogramming or cure attempts, which really amount to a kind of self-hypnosis. If you practice self-hypnosis long enough, something else will happen. These same people are sponsoring the hell houses, which are nothing in the world but a psychiatric, spiritual, and physical abuse of children. And these Jesus camps, now I've watched a number of footage of these Jesus camps. They're nothing in the world but brown shirt camps. They differ in no way from fascism. Moral fascism, spiritual fascism is still fascism. And the idea of reducing the church down to a kind of corporatism is also a very severe sin, and something that so corrupts the faith and drives more and more people into atheism. So I want to ask people to be a little bit more reticent. Have a little bit of humility and meekness, with the possibility that your ideology might not amount to faith, and that terrorism is not an appropriate way to preach the gospel, and that people can be healed through love. They cannot be healed through terror, fear, bullying, cursing, condemnation, dehumanizing. They can be healed through the power of co-suffering love and by no other means. Otherwise, these televangelists and these fundamentalists and other spiritual terrorists are simply going to create wave after wave of new atheism. Darwin is not responsible for modern atheism. Evolution is not responsible for modern atheism. Christian preachers and Christian ideology and cruelty and hate and violence and these spiritual terrorists who dominate the podiums of so many Christian churches in North America. This is the source of modern atheism, pure and simple. And we need to have people think about this prayerfully, sincerely, and ask hyper-Christians to, for the first time in their lives, become honest. And honest, first of all, about themselves. And remember that moral outrage is a form of confession, because we hate most in others what we fear most in ourselves. Moral grief is not moral outrage. Moral grief is an expression of co-suffering love, not howling, shrieking, screaming, waving arms, and dancing around a stage, spewing hate and malice, as if in the name of God.